Okay, welcome to San Francisco's Mechanics Institute. We're here for the fourth round of the Tuesday night marathon and our weekly lecture here, which we tend to stream nowadays, something new with our media person, Juan Zendejas. Tonight we're talking about magnificent Magnus. The world champion has really asserted himself in these last weeks. He just finished yesterday the Gashimov Memorial in Azerbaijan, and he had an incredible performance there, almost 3,000 performance. He was finished 2 points ahead of the field. They were all 10 people of the top 12 players in the world. He had the tournament won with a round to go, but even then he just continued to play for the win every game. Just like Bobby Fischer in his prime. He doesn't care about the event, the opponent, he just plays to win. So I call this lecture Maximum Magnus. It kind of reminds me of that old movie Gladiator with Russell Crowe, where he was Maximus. Took apart all his opponents. So we're going to start with a couple of Magnus's game, and of course we have to do something from our own Tuesday night marathon. But this is some of the most incredible chess we've seen in the last couple of years. He's really in top form. His now current rating is 2861, which no other player in history has been that high. Magnus a few years ago was a little higher, but anybody else, Kasparov, Caruana, their very peak rating was in the 2850s, and of course Caruana's down to 2810, so there's this huge gap between first and second place. You're reminded of Carlsen of the great world champions from yesteryear, maybe Capablanca or Yekin, perhaps Fischer, but they're just so far ahead of their competition. So we're going to start with this round 7 game. Magnus had white against Anish Giri, and Giri is famous for being a very solid opponent, somebody who's very difficult to beat. But Magnus had white. He starts with an English opening, pawn to c4, and Giri replies pawn to e5, so we have a reverse Sicilian. Knight to c3 by white, knight f6, knight f3 by Magnus, knight c6, a 4 knights kind of Sicilian, and Magnus plays g3, which is called the Brennan system. Kind of a dragon reversed. Giri plays pawn to d5. Magnus does pawn takes d5. Knight takes d5 by Giri. Bishop to g2. And Giri plays aggressively bishop to c5. I'm not so worried about knight takes e5 because of knight takes c3 on the queen. So Magnus just castles. Giri also castles. And Magnus plays pawn to d3, developing the dark squared bishop exactly like a dragon. And now if Giri would play bishop to e6, then knight g5 would be very annoying. So Giri just does pawn to h6, holding the squares. Still not afraid of the discovery on d5. If white plays knight takes e5, black replies knight takes c3 on the queen on d1. So after pawn to h6, Magnus just takes the knight on d5. Giri recaptures on d5 with the queen. And Magnus plays pawn to a3. It's a little more aggressive than if you have the Sicilian dragon. you've got the white side, so you're trying to gain some space. You're trying to gain an advantage with this setup. And black is a little more off balance. There's the queen on d5 instead of the light squared bishop. So black has to be a little careful. Geary plays pawn to a5, a good move, restricting the white pawn's queenside advance. And Magnus just develops with bishop to d2. And Geary decides, well, enough of these discoveries on the long diagonal. The black queen comes to e6, so it's safely out of the way. Magnus develops with rook to c1, attacking the bishop on c5. Geary plays queen e7, defending. And Magnus plays bishop to c3. He's got all his pieces out, kind of ready for some activity, maybe pawn to d4, queen a4. But still, he's not clearly gained any advantage yet. Now, after bishop c3, Geary jumps in the middle, knight to d4, stopping some white advances. But Magnus chases it out with pawn to e3, and Geary swaps off, knight takes knight on f3, and the white queen takes on f3. All the white pieces are out. If white can get some advance in the center, it could be very good. Meanwhile, black still has this problem of getting everything developed. Yet there's no weaknesses in black's camp, so it's not so easy to do anything. Geary now retreats the bishop to d6, getting out of the way of some advance of pawn to d4. And Magnus plays queen to h5. And Geary simply closes down this long white diagonal with pawn to c6, and it looks very solid for the black side. People thought, okay, just tiny advantage for the white side, but Geary's a very solid player. What are you going to do? How can you make progress on this position?
White has 9 pieces developed against 6 or 7 for black. Isn't that a plus for white?
Okay, I would agree with you, Peter. It's a plus for white. You should have something, but how do you achieve something from that? And you're welcome to suggest a move, because Magnus's next move surprised all the commentators. A4, well,
no,
H4. Okay, maybe that would surprise them too. It takes some squares.
Well, is it black or white?
It's white to move.
Ah, okay, I was going to say that would be black and what to do, but
E4?
okay.
No, the F pawn.
Okay, we've gotten all these very reasonable suggestions, but we're taking Guy. This is maximum Magnus. He's just going for it in this tournament. Pawn to f4, very good guy.
I play that, that's how come I know.
Okay, so far like Magnus, I noticed the resemblance. And now tell us the next moves, please. So Geary just takes.
Takes with the center pawn.
Takes with the center pawn. Well, okay, here we have our gladiator. No prisoners, no prisoners. Magnus took with the G pawn.
Wow.
Just offering this tasty morsel with check.
Wow.
He's just taking no prisoners. You know, opened up this diagonal. He's got the leading development that Peter says.
I begin to think he's a little crazy.
No doubt, no doubt.
Wow.
But let's put you in Gary's shoes here. Okay, you're facing the crazy Magnus, who happens to be beating everybody, but let's not worry about that for the
The only
moment.
advantage you would have is if he takes a common check, he can bring the rook over.
Well, there you are. You're offered this pawn with check, and just because he's Magnus, are you going to be a coward and decline that?
It would be rude not to accept, right?
Well, sorry, what's
It
that?
would be rude not to accept.
You would feel, there, he's offering me that, and just because he's Magnus, I'm not going to take it. No, you feel bad. You feel.
Now that that rook comes over,
Well, you would play, e4 is a problem if you don't take.
Yeah, they can advance. You have to worry. No matter what you do, you're going to worry. And that's the problem. And probably he should be safe, just move his king over, but he couldn't resist it. He's been called a coward too often. And he just took that pawn, queen takes e3 check.
Okay.
Now these isolated pawns, you've got an extra pawn. Okay, king has to move, and well, then you get another tempo. But the problem is, white's pieces come to life. Now the king's in the corner is actually very useful for this G file. And I guess this guy said that a rook is coming over here on the E line. So white really has an initiative now. And black has to be very careful. It's now a hard defense. And you can't take the D pawn, queen takes D3, the rook comes over.
That's too greedy.
Yeah, that's clearly too greedy. So after white did king to h1, Geary tried to get back for some defense over here, played rook to d8.
Oh, that's nice.
And okay, Magnus brought the rook on c to e1, getting power in the center. Once again, it's not good to take this pawn. Queen takes d3, pawn to f5. All the white pieces are coming in there, threatening pawn to f6. If black would play pawn to f6, white could smash through with bishop takes f6.
What about bishop takes pawn? Go back to
Sorry,
if bishop takes f. Oh no, it's on it twice. Never mind.
we've got a rook on f1. We, like we just got this big set. Hopefully people can see all the pieces. Last week we had a bit of a problem with the dark squares in the pieces. Tell me if things aren't visible enough.
Oh, there, yeah. Oh, that's nice. That's an interesting move.
Okay, so rook on c to e1, and you don't want to take the d pawn. You retreat queen to c5, trying to trade the queens, but naturally pawn to f5, keeping the queens, keeping the attack. And bishop to f8, getting out of the way of the rook, holding the king side. Magnus not even concerned, the pawn down, just move the pieces to the center. Bishop e4. And Geary is rightly worried because all of the bishops and rooks and queen are over on the king side, and he offers the exchange just to break up the attack some. He figures if he gets a pawn for the exchange, these isolated pawns, that you'll be very close to even materially. And do you think Magnus took that exchange?
Of course not.
No, not this Magnus. Didn't even think about it. So you just add pressure. Rook f3, well, one, it blocks the diagonal, can swing over, and now the other rook can swing over to G1. You feel the pressure just adding up here. And those of you who have seen the Morphy games, look at the black pieces, the rook on A8, the bishop on C8. That's your basic lesson. Don't leave your pieces undeveloped. So he knows he's in trouble here. What to do though? Okay, so he plays pawn to B5. To at least get these pieces out a bit.
Can this bishop take the F pawn?
No, there's two.
See, there's a rook on F3,
Oh, there's too many.
bishop on E4, queen on H5. So
Oh, okay.
too many guarding the F5
There's three.
pawn.
1, 2, yeah, 3. Okay.
So bishop takes the F pawn, you can just go back, or possible, yeah.
The rook would just
Yeah,
take
yeah.
on F5.
Yeah, that's clean, yeah, that's a good spot. And then, also, it would create a lot of
Chris,
space.
what about G6 though instead?
G6 instead. Yes, yes. In fact, we're going to get there.
You could bring the pawn.
You can't take
Oh,
the pawn.
thank you. Yes, you could take the pawn. Very nice. And then pawn takes G6, rook takes queen on H5. Thank you for that checkmate. These beautiful bishops.
Oh, yeah.
Which illustrates what kind of problems black is having in this position. So instead of pawn to G6, black did pawn to B5, and clearly rook on E to G1, more pressure on the king side. And well, what can you really do? He plays rook to A7, so it can swing over to the king side if things open up over there.
Also, queen takes the H.
Well, now you don't want to do queen takes pawn on
could.
H6
Yeah, you could.
because of queen takes the rook on G1 with
Yeah,
check,
right.
and then taking the queen on H6. But the thing is, you have a lot of good moves for the white side. This position is winning for white with all these aggressively placed pieces. And it was Magnus's Norwegian colleague, Jonathan Tisdale, a grandmaster in Norway, who said sometimes when you have so many overwhelming choices, it's hard to find the right one. So I think something like rook on from F3 to G3 is probably, you're going to crash through pretty quickly if you do that. Some lines like well, now you are threatening queen
Now-
takes
Now you're
F6.
threatening it, yeah.
Yeah, so that really would win, I think, pretty quickly. Magnus instead played bishop to F6, which is maybe not quite as quick, but also very strong. And now Gary did play pawn to G6, and it's not a checkmate anymore. If white plays pawn takes G6, yeah, there's no rook helping out on F7. So Magnus just retreated with the queen. Sorry, someone else?
I was saying the rook is on A7, but that's right. Otherwise, rook takes pawn works. Otherwise.
Yes, rook takes G6 you would think about.
Almost.
And you know what? Afterwards, the computer said that's quite possible to go
Really?
rook takes. The problem is you kind of know you're winning anyway, and you want to sacrifice a rook.
Okay.
Pawn takes check, somebody has to get in the way, so maybe the rook, and you could take the rook on g7, bishop takes g7, pawn to f6 is, yeah, that's probably going to win also. Maybe Geary could throw in a check, but it's that ought to win for white. But if you feel you're certain to win the game, and you don't have to sacrifice a rook. So he retreated queen to h3. Now maybe you can even just take the rook on d5. Geary retreated, attacked rook to d6, attacking the bishop on f6, and Magnus moved the queen to h4, guarding it. Now there's so many threats. Pawn takes g6 is a huge threat. Pawn to g5 simply wouldn't work. Rook takes g5 check. Pawn takes and queen to h8 checkmate. So Geary decided he has to sacrifice the exchange. Rook takes f6. Queen takes f6. And again, you sacrifice the exchange. Well, you're only down 1 point, except the attack is still raging. So Geary chases the white queen away with bishop to e7. And Magnus says, well, that's sort of enough. Time to be professional. Queen takes c6, so he's a clear exchange up. In fact, in an ending, because, well, black has no choice but to trade queens. So maybe you have a chance against some people when you're the exchange down in an ending, but against Magnus, it's just really not much hope here. Geary continues, king g7, pawn takes g6, pawn takes g6, and Magnus plays pawn to d4. He wants to keep this long diagonal from a8 to h1 all closed, so pawn to d5 will help with that. Little for black to do. He did pawn to a4, pawn to d5, pawn to b4, trying to trade the queenside pawns, and Magnus hit him on the king side with bishop to e8. That's about the end.
Why did he not do that before he moved the pawn out?
Well, he wanted this long diagonal to be closed. So he put the white pawn on d5, so bishop
Okay, okay, got you.
bishop b7 won't be annoying him. And Geary blocks the g line with bishop to g5. So Magnus just opens it up, pawn to h4. Geary takes, bishop takes h4, rook takes g6, king h7, rook c6 on the bishop on c8. Doesn't really matter. Bishop comes to g4, rook to f4. And Geary managed to play rook to g7, his 39th move, but his flag fell at this point. It doesn't matter. You could check with the bishop on g6. Rook takes g6, rook takes g6, king takes, and white would just be winning all the pawns and everything. So that was fun to see. A very powerful game by Magnus. He just went for it straight from the beginning, and didn't mind taking risks. And with that game, that was the 7th round. He got a clear lead in the tournament, and at that he was 1 point ahead there. The next game, he played his old rival, Sergei Karyakin, who was, Karyakin was only half a point behind going into the 8th round. And Karyakin had the white pieces against Magnus. So, what do you do if you're Karyakin? This is your last white in the tournament. You're half a point behind the leader, who's going to get white in the last round. Well, if you have any pride, you have to try to win the game. And that again is a difficult thing to do against Magnus. If you recall the World Championship match from 2016, it was between Karyakin and Magnus, and that was a very closely fought contest. And in fact, after 12 games, it ended 6-6. And there, again, Magnus wasn't in the form that he is now. He only won one game, he only lost one game. But Karyakin was being very defensive in that match. So here, Karyakin with white, he starts out pawn to e4. He's trying to win the game. And Magnus plays his opening pawn to c5, knight f3, knight c6, pawn d4, pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, pawn to e5. This is Magnus's defense these years. The Sveshnikov Sicilian. You may get some weak square in the center on d5, but you immediately attack the center. You gain some time. You gain development. And he played a lot of these. I think it was 4 of these openings. This defense against Caruana in the recent World Championship match in November. So Magnus is heavily prepared in this opening. And they repeat what Caruana did for a while. Knight on d to b5, pawn to d6, and knight to d5, which has to be taken. Knight takes d5, pawn takes d5, knight e7.
After pawn takes d5, what's the next move?
Knight to e7 by black.
Okay.
Yes, is there someone who could help you there a little bit? Just make
No,
sure.
I'm following. It's okay.
Okay, but
So it was knight c to e7, right?
yes, there's only one knight left.
Oh yeah.
The others got exchanged, and knight from c6 to e7.
Okay, thank you.
So white to move, and Karyakin played pawn to c4, guarding c5, taking some squares there. Magnus plays knight to g6. Karyakin plays queen to a4, just as Caruana did, threatening the discovered check on the long diagonal. So Magnus plays bishop to d7. Karyakin plays queen to b4. The knight and queen on the d6 pawn, defended only by the bishop on f8. So Magnus plays bishop to f5, guarding it twice. Karyakin goes back, queen to a4, threatening the discovered. Magnus goes back, bishop to d7. Karyakin goes back, queen to b4. Magnus goes back, bishop to f5. Now, well, he can't. That's the problem. He can't. Karyakin could go back queen to a4 and claim a 3-time repetition.
Yeah.
But he doesn't want to.
Now you're half a point behind the leader. You're invited to this super tournament.
Yeah,
You have the white pieces. You just can't do that.
Can't take the draw.
You can't take the draw. When I would play these tournaments, I'd say, better to lose and give it a try. And there's nothing wrong with your position.
Yeah.
Okay, Magnus has been very careful with his defense, but white is certainly not worse. So, Karyakin plays pawn to h4.
Huh?
And you don't want to get sidetracked over there. Knight takes h4, rook takes queen takes, you get fork knight c7. So Magnus plays pawn to h5. And all this, it's still been seen in the Caruana match. But here comes a new move from Karyakin, bishop to g5, and that's a theoretical novelty.
Is it a good one?
Now, Magnus just runs away queen to b8, and he certainly had prepared for this bishop g5 in his preparation for Caruana. So he's on familiar ground.
So he didn't want to push the pawn.
Sorry, what was that guy?
He didn't want to push the F.
Oh, yes. You don't really mind moving your pieces around, but you don't want to hurt your pawn structure. If you'd gone pawn to f6, well, look at this bishop on e7. How is it getting out? In this position with a blocked center, it's more important to get your pieces and pawns on the right squares than get everything out so quickly. That being said, I think we can trust Magnus that weeks of preparation that he's come up with the best move in that position. So queen to b8 and bishop e2 by white. Magnus kicks the knight back with pawn to a6, knight to c3, and again not rushing. Magnus plays queen to c7. At this point, Karyakin plays pawn to g3, and finally Magnus develops with bishop to e7, and he'd be very happy to trade these dark squared bishops off.
Would he take with the queen or the knight?
I would think I would take with the knight there. I don't really like the knight on that square.
Plus queen is pressure on the c5 pawn.
Yes. But you could probably take with either. I do like the queen on this square, as you say, Ronaldo.
Would it be too dangerous to rotate your cap with the king?
It's possible. You have to worry sometimes about things opening up, but I think you're right. Take with the king, bring the rook out.
Also.
But that was all moot because Karyakin simply retreated with bishop to e3, trying to keep black bottled up in the center here. And this is where we see how Magnus really has a sense of this opening. You're wondering exactly what black does in this position. And this move, I confess I would be a bit afraid to do on the black side. Magnus plays pawn to e4 so that his knight has a future. I admit I'd worry that you're loosening these squares here. These pawns don't really work together. This f-pawn's not coming through. And the computer, in fact, likes the position on the white side. But Magnus was aware of that. Even after the game, he says, okay, the computer likes the position, but he and his team and his computers have seemed deeper than your, average, stockfish or LC0 that would have 5 minutes to look at this position. And what happens, Karyakin castles, and Magnus just castles.
Which castle?
King side,
Inside.
both of them, both castle king side.
You could castle queen side to save the pawn, but you'd be in big trouble there. But here he just gives up this H pawn, which Karyakin takes,
Ah, yikes.
and Magnus simply isn't worried. I can't call it a new Magnus, but this resurgent Magnus, give up pawns, no fear. When he played Caruana in the match, he seemed so afraid to lose a game because it was so hard to win a game, he might lose his title. And even when he had better positions against Caruana, he seemed ready to head just for the rapid playoffs, which he knew he could win. But here, okay, you lose a pawn on the king side,
Just knight F3, yes.
we're just gonna take some squares.
Plus you're attacking now, double attacking the weak C pawn, and the bishop cannot come back.
Well, I think it did come back.
Oh, it can come back down, yeah, in the lower one.
You're absolutely right, you're attacking the C pawn.
And you can now put the rook too,
Um,
behind the queen.
E4.
Forcing the queen exchange.
So the bishop did come back to E2,
Yeah.
guarding the C
Right.
pawn. It's not doing anything on H5
Right.
anyway. And here's Magnus, just calm, you're pawn down, don't worry. Queen to D7, you're trying to get in on the light squares over here. Karyakin doesn't like that. He offers the trade of queens, queen to A4. And Magnus isn't playing any endgame here. He retreats queen to C8.
If he trades out the white square bishop, isn't his black knight stronger?
The knight on E5. Yes, I think we will get to that in a moment. And it's this position, Karyakin's feeling kind of worried over here, and with this pawn on E4 cramping him a bit. So he shoves the pawn to C5, and Magnus takes that, pawn takes C5, and Karyakin knight takes E4. So Karyakin's trying to take more control of those light squares. And here comes a very nice move. You want to try to cut the white position. Magnus plays pawn to C4, keeping this queen on A4 over on that side of the board. This is actually quite a critical position. Okay, white is a pawn ahead, a little worries there, but he could probably maintain the balance. In the postmortem, they said the surprising queen to C2, kind of walking into a pin, was actually the best square.
The knight was hanging.
The knight is hanging, yes. But Karyakin chose a different way to save his knight. He simply retreated knight to C3. The problem is this knight's now over on the queen side. So now comes another powerful move. Magnus played pawn to B5, which we will get back to. But instead of pawn to B5, he could have done, I think it was what Guy suggested, bishop to D3, trying to get rid of that bishop. And bishop could take on D3, and Magnus wouldn't even recapture. He would play knight to F3 check. King has to go to G2, knight takes H4 check, and this game would end in a draw. It doesn't matter, if the king goes back to G1, knight F3 check, so you take on H4, pawn takes H4, queen G4 check. Black just checks on H4, G4, perpetual check. You're in the lead for the tournament. You have white in the last round. Okay, maybe that would be the Magnus of a year ago who would choose that. But not here. Here he decided, let's be aggressive. Bishop's on F5. Yes. Instead of bishop to D3, he played pawn to B5, attacking the queen on A4. Queen had to retreat to D1. And here was Magnus's plan. Still pawn down. Doesn't look easy to get in, but pawn to B4. And this knight on C3 has to go further away. Knight A4, where it's kind of out of play. Okay, that being said, you better do something quickly on the black side. You know, knight B6, something else. You're loose on the queen side, but Magnus plays bishop to E4, and queen to H3 is an extremely powerful threat. Karyakin comes up queen to D4, attacking the pieces in the center. And Magnus plays queen to F5. So knight F3 check is a tremendous threat, just winning on the light squares. You have to do something with white, but it's not so easy.
And yet,
Yes?
would you say this reminds you of Garry Kasparov back in the day?
I certainly would agree.
It reminds me very much of that famous game against Karpov where the knight is sort of stranded, right? The white check attacks the d-pawn, it doesn't do any good.
Was that a King's Indian defense?
No, it wasn't that, it was a Sicilian, right?
Oh, okay.
Sicilian with black goes d5 to break up the Razibon.
Yes.
It's really, it's pretty amazing. It's very, very active, very focused on the initiative, very sort of precise play.
And I would agree with you. This is just like Kasparov, like Fischer, like Alyekin. It's this very aggressive, tactical attacking chess. And you forget that Magnus is really good at this stuff, just because he wins all the endgames. But here white is in trouble, and you could try pawn to F3. Maybe it's best. There's a long tactical line that knight takes F3, rook takes, bishop takes. You get pinned, rook to F1, but there's this tactical comeback, bishop F6 attacking the queen. If the queen can't go somewhere where the white squared bishop attacks it, queen D2, pawn to C3, white will end up the exchange down. Maybe for a pawn. This was probably his best chance at defense after black's queen to F5. But Karyakin played a very reasonable looking move, pawn to F4, just stopping the queen from getting in, stopping a black piece from coming to F3. Unfortunately, Magnus played queen to G6, you know, threatening a knockout blow on G3. And okay, the white bishop came from E2 to E3 to F2, guarding the G3 square. And now Magnus simply plays knight to D3. And he's a pawn down. No, well, not huge immediate threat, but he controls the board. The knight on D3 controls E1 and C1. The black bishop on E4 controls all these light squares. And Karyakin, maybe he has to get rid of this knight, but to give up all these light squares after bishop takes D3 out of taking with the pawn or bishop. would be a tremendous edge for black. And meanwhile, bishop on e7 takes h4 is a threat because the g pawn is pinned. So Karyakin tried pawn to h5, attacking the queen. Okay, but Magnus says it doesn't matter, just a pawn. Queen to f5, eyeing the e3 square, and not so much to do. Maybe bishop takes d3 would be best, but Karyakin goes bishop to g4, forcing the exchange of bishops. Magnus takes with queen takes g4. Karyakin does queen takes e4. Now the bishops have traded. Magnus plays bishop d6. Still a pawn down, but in complete control. The h5 pawn is loose. The rooks are coming to the e line. There's no active play for the white side. And bishop takes or knight takes f4 is a threat. So Karyakin retreated, queen to g2. Bring the pieces in, rook a to e8. Threatening rook to e2. Bishop to d4 by Karyakin. Magnus takes a pause, queen takes h5, getting his pawn back, feeling there's no rush. Karyakin plays queen f3, trying to trade the queens. Queen g6, avoiding it. And still, what can white do? Plays king h1. And anyone have a suggestion here? It's not tactical. It's just when you get a position like this, you think, oh, you ought to have something with this loose king. But
Rook e4.
thank you. So get all your pieces into play, and then the knockout blow will be easy. And that's what Magnus did. Rook e4, so that the other rook can join in. And Karyakin retreated, and after Magnus doubled rooks, Karyakin looked. He's wondering what he can do. There's threats everywhere, and he gave up.
What would have happened on f5 instead of the rook move?
Okay, f5. Probably we would go queen h6 check. Where should we move that king? Not sure it matters. G1, and then we'd play rook to e2.
Oh, rook takes bishop.
Oh, thank you. Rook takes bishop, even better. Your bishop to f2, rook to e8. It sort of doesn't matter what you do. Rook to d1, and we could take the bishop on f2. The queen takes rook to e2. If rook takes on f2, rook e3 wins the g pawn, and the black pieces are swarming in for the mate. So Karyakin, who's a very tough player to beat, he went down with the white pieces, and then Magnus had already won the tournament with a round to go, having a 1.5 lead. I would like to show you the last round was also fun, but more important is one of our TNM games. So I'm going to show one of those. Just a little other news. One of our club members, Ralph Palmieri, is playing in the Reykjavik Open in Iceland. He won his second round.
Oh, good.
So always nice to see our club members traveling the world, playing somewhere. So some great entertainment from last Tuesday was Ezra Chambers against Seuss Jacobian. And Ezra had the white pieces, starts with his usual pawn to e4, and Seuss plays the French defense, which a lot of people don't like to play against because it slows the game down, becomes strategic. And we get, after pawn to d4, pawn to d5, knight c3, bishop b4, we have a classic Wiener War. Ezra did pawn to e5, pawn to a3.
Whoops.
Actually,
Sorry, pawn to c5 by black, pawn to a3 by white, bishop takes c3, check, b takes c3, knight e7, and Ezra does something that became fashionable about 10 or 15 years ago. Take some space on the king side with pawn to h4. Seuss plays knight on b to c6, pawn to h5, threatening to make problems on the dark squares with pawn to h6, so black stops that, pawn to h6 himself. And Ezra plays queen to g4, hitting the g7 pawn. Now, this is kind of a neat way to defend it. Any French player has probably seen this. Knight comes to f5, guarding g7. White bishop comes to d3, trying to get rid of the defender of g7. And Seuss just castles, not worrying about that the bishop on c1 can get that h6 pawn. But there's no good way to make that happen, because on bishop takes f5, there's always the tempo, pawn takes f5, attacking the queen. So white doesn't have time for this strong attack. It's got to go a bit slowly. So Ezra just develops knight to f3, and Seuss plays queen to a5, hitting the pawn on c3, bishop to d2 by white, and pawn to c4 by black. Now, Ezra decides to take the knight on f5. Having played a lot of these positions on the white side, I just don't like doing that. I would have retreated the bishop to e2 and played a slow game where the center is set, the white queen can retreat, the pawn go to g4, try to make a slow attack with the pawns. But instead, after pawn to c4, Ezra takes the knight on f5, pawn takes f5, queen to g3. Okay, the pawns are doubled, you're threatening bishop h6, but black controls squares here. So king to h7, and it's very hard to get into the black position. Ezra plays pawn to a4, good move, so that the dark squared bishop has some potential to get it to a3. Seuss plays rook to g8. Oh, I'm sorry, I had missed this move, castles before pawn to c4. So white already has castles in. Doesn't change the tactics, but it's white's move in this position. And Ezra played rook to e1. Black develops, bishop to d7. Queen to f4. Knight to e7. Oh, okay, and sorry, the move castles had been met by queen to c7. My apologies. skipping the two moves, castles and queen c7, so white's move in the position, bishop to c1. The queen returned to a5, attacking the c3 pawn, and bishop came to a3, attacking the knight on e7. We get to where all the fun starts here. Anyone's suggesting a move for black? Thinking like Magnus in the previous games. Okay, good defensive move would be rook to e8, guarding the knight and so. Seuss was in an aggressive frame of mind.
G5.
Thank you.
Oh,
Pawn to g5.
open that G5. Oh.
If you don't take on passant, these black pawns are very aggressive on the king side. But Ezra has to take, pawn takes g6 on passant, and knight takes g6. You have horrible pawns on the king side. But what you do have are very active pieces and an open file over there. And that's good compensation for the weak pawns. So Ezra has to retreat with the queen, and he went back to d2. He should probably go queen to h2, keeping a little more control over those kingside squares. This queen to d2 allows black to get some initiative over there. Queen d8, headed back over to the king side. Ezra tries to run a bit out of the way of that g-file. King to f1, knight h4, and black's trying to come in. But Ezra tries to be a little sneaky. Bishop to c1, hoping for knight takes knight and queen takes h6 checkmate. Didn't happen. Rook to g6, nice defensive move, but also prepares to double at some point. And now kind of a nice move, king to e2 by Ezra. So if the knight on h4 would take the pawn on g2, there'd be rook to h1 and play on that h-file. Seuss doesn't go for that. He does knight takes f3. And here I might take with the pawn, just being a bit of a coward. I have my king at least very safe here. I'm not too worried about that h-pawn being a passed pawn. It's all isolated. We're still in the middle game. But Ezra was brave, did king takes f3.
Starting to look like the bomb cloud.
The what?
It starts to look a little bit like the bomb cloud.
Bomb cloud?
F3 hasn't been played yet.
Palm.
It's the bomb cloud where white plays king e2 on the second move.
Oh. Okay. Well, he didn't intentionally try to emulate it. Okay, queen to h4 with threats. Now you really have to be careful. Pawn to g3, queen to g4 check, king to g2, and so it's triples on the open file. So you've got to worry in a position like this. It's, and Ezra really needs to do queen to f4 and try to get the queens off the board. But here he made a mistake. Rook to h1. Again, he just really wants to checkmate him on that h6 square. But this unfortunately leaves the center open, and queen to e4 check was a problem. Where does the king go? If you go king to g1, rook takes g3 check. was gonna wipe you out. So he played King H2. And here, can we get any suggestions for the black side? Who said that? Queen H4 check. And if I take it, check and mate by the bishop. And Seuss should have played your move. He should have played your move, but it was a little like, and thank you for that. That's a very nice mate with the queen sacrifice. But a little like Magnus, when you have a lot of good moves, you'll miss some of the others. And he played rook to g5, threatening rook h4 check, and still the king can't go to g1. Okay, we fortunately about done here. Continue queen to d1, pawn to f4, and which opens the bishop up. And once again, there's no real defense. Rook e1, queen f5, bishop takes f4, and black gets in on the light squares. Check. Rook h5, queen to f3, check.
Oh.
King f1, and anyone see the finish here?
Bishop check.
Bishop check.
Bishop to
Bishop to g4, winning the queen with, and here Ezra resigned. So that was a difference in rating of 500 points.
wow.
Okay, thank you. Good luck in your game.